Now that we have a good understanding of the Create React App application structure that gets created for us, it's important for us to understand how Create React App actually transpiles our source code from our source folder. If we open up React here, from our source folder into an actual executing application that is supported by multiple browsers. Now, the reason why this is important is that Create React App is actually set up to allow us to use an ECMAScript 6 syntax in our JavaScript, whereas ECMAScript 5 is the most commonly implemented JavaScript version across browser types. So if we go to the React or the Create React App GitHub repository and we look at their documentation page, if we scroll down here, we can read about the philosophy of this particular node executable package that builds a React app for us. And really down here, we get to see what's included. And it's this first line here that is really important, as well as down here where it talks about how it uses Babel. And we'll get to Babel in a second. So the really important thing is that in this Create React App, we get all set up for us the ability to use both React.js, which we'll talk about in a little bit, as well as ES6 TypeScript and some Flow syntax support. Now, we're not going to worry about TypeScript or Flow, but we are going to worry about these first three right here. Now, React, of course, is the JavaScript framework that we're using to create those front-end applications or those single-page applications. JSX is it's kind of a placeholder for HTML inside of React applications. It's the markup language that is very similar to HTML that we use to define the user interface within our React components, so that way our React components actually hold the definition of their user interface. It's what gets translated by React into the HTML that we actually see displayed in our user interfaces for a particular component. Now, the really important thing is this ES6 support. So let's talk about ES6 versus ES5 and why this is so important. Now, if you do a search on ES6 versus ES5 and you want to see the new features that are in the JavaScript language as of the ECMAScript 6 definition, you can look up this page right here. It's es6-features.org. It's a really cool website because it allows us to see the differences in syntax between ES5 and ES6 as implemented in JavaScript. And the reason why this is important is that ES5 is supported across pretty much every browser out there, and ES6 is still being implemented across browsers, meaning that not every single browser has all of the features of ES6 yet in their version of JavaScript. And that tells you right there that JavaScript is different for each of the browsers that we're working with. Now, it used to be a lot worse when it comes down to how JavaScript was implemented in each browser back in the early 2000s when I first started doing web development, like back in 2000. In fact, JavaScript was different in different browsers created by different companies, and you actually had to try to support each of those different versions differently when you built web applications. Nowadays, the browsers are a lot closer to being in sync with the current version of JavaScript. They just are not very fast at implementing the current version. And ES5 seems to be the most widely implemented across browsers. But we receive a lot of really cool new syntax and features in JavaScript with ES6. So if you come to this website, we can see some of the differences here, such as constants. Constants didn't exist in ES5. They were introduced with ES6. And this code right here, this constant pi, you would see in order to create a constant, this is what you would have to do in ES5. And you can see that this has provided a lot of functionality and a lot of reduction in code if we want to have a constant variable. Other ones are such as expression bodies and getting arrow functions. So arrow functions are now extremely feature-rich and usable in JavaScript ES6. They reduce a lot of the code that we are writing, and they're not supported in ES5. So in order to use arrow functions in our code, we would have to use ES6, and it would not run in a lot of different browsers that haven't implemented that functionality yet. Now, there are some ES6 features that have been implemented across all browsers, but not every ES6 feature has been implemented across browsers. So this is a really good resource if you want to see the difference between ES6 JavaScript not context, but syntax. And then if we want to figure out whether or not a particular ES6 feature has been implemented across all browsers, there's a really good website for that. It's called caniuse.com. And can I use is a really good option. And here we can look up arrow functions. And here you can see with arrow functions, IE11 actually has not supported or implemented support for arrow functions yet. Now, Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, and iOS Safari have. Opera has not. Well, Opera Mini has not. Android has, Opera has, Chrome has, Firefox for Android. So there's a lot that have and some that have not. And so it depends on what version of the browsers you need to support in order to make it functional across all of those browsers, in order to make your UI functional across all those browsers. So Can I Use is extremely good when you are writing vanilla JavaScript. So when you are creating JavaScript libraries, you need to make sure you have this Can I Use open, and you're verifying whether or not features that you are using in your JavaScript are actually supported across browsers. Now, if we had to use this resource and we had to look at this and we had to figure out whether or not we could write ES6 or we had to write ES5 when we are developing a library, that can be extremely time consuming and extremely painful. In order to kind of overcome that, what they have implemented in the Create React app is they have decided that we will be able to use all of ES6's features, which means every feature that we see here, all of these new features in ES6 inside of JavaScript, we can use them. And instead of needing to identify whether we can use it in our code, they have decided we can just use it. And then they use a tool called Babel. And Babel is another JavaScript library that has been created to create a standard, or not really a standard, but it is a JavaScript compiler that can take one version of JavaScript and compile it to another version of JavaScript so that it can become compatible with all other browsers. And the example they have right here is in regular old ES5 JavaScript, we had the var. And var is how we created a variable, and it's how we created all variables, is with just var. In ES6, we received the let keyword, which allowed us to create variables which had a different scope than var has. And so with that, we can use let when we are writing ES6, but for compatibility across all browsers, it's best to use var. So with this utility, Babel, and because it has been implemented inside of the Create React app, when our application is compiled so that it can be displayed in browsers, Babel actually takes care of taking our ES6 syntax, which is anything in this list. It has already, the developers of it have already gone through and found out what is compatible with all the other browsers and what is not. And then it will go through all the code that we have written, and anywhere where it finds let, it'll convert it to a var. Anywhere where it sees that we have used const, right here, it will create something like this instead for us, so we don't have to write this code. We can just use const. And it's the same with arrow functions. When it sees an arrow function, it will then convert it to something like this for us, and that way it's backwards compatible with browsers that have not implemented all of the ES6 syntax. So Babel is extremely important for us to allow us to write modern JavaScript and use all of the new features that help us write better JavaScript, yet still have our applications be backwards compatible for browsers that have not yet implemented all of the ES6 compatibility. And that is how transpiling source code works. Now, you may have heard of compiling. Compiling is where we take our source code and we compile it down to machine code or binary so that it can be executed on a machine directly. Whereas transpiling is where we take one version of a programming language and we convert it to another version of the programming language in order to help with compatibility across its execution environments. And in this case, the execution environments we're talking about are browsers. And since browsers are made by different companies and have different compatibility levels, we need to make sure that our ES6 gets transpiled down to a compatible version of JavaScript, while still using the really cool new features that the latest versions of JavaScript provide us. Hopefully this helps you understand the difference between ES6 and ES5 as it applies to JavaScript, and why we're allowed to use ES6 in our React apps. And that is solely because the creators of the Create React app library have implemented the Babel utility for compiling or transpiling our source from the current version of JavaScript down to a compatible version of JavaScript so it can run in all of the browsers, no matter what browser somebody is using.